Thank you so much. I was chuffed to bits when I found that you were joining.
Thank you very much, Ray. A couple of fantastic sessions this afternoon, lots of heart and energy, but I'm an academic. So I'm going to bring back a bit of head and a bit of thinking. The kindness, the trust, the relationships are crucial to creating an environment within which kids can grow at school. But school is there to help them grow, to help them expand their competence. And we are the agents of helping to focus and facilitate the expansion of that competence. So I wanted to just muse aloud with you about the things that are on my mind, the questions that seem to be around in the air. I'm lucky enough to travel quite a lot these days. I'm working in a lot of different countries, so I feel as if I can get a feel for the kinds of things that people are worrying about around the planet. And I want to talk about some of those things and then put that in the context of some of the things that I've been involved in and things that many people in this room have been involved in. So I've got four main questions. And the first one is this. It's like, what are people around the world worrying about? What are the big questions? Sometimes I go to meetings, I was going to say like this, but I've never been to a meeting like this before, but go to education meetings, and people are talking about little details of this and the curriculum that and the assessment that. And it sounds to me like there are often kind of quite not just one, but a number of enormous elephants in the room that people aren't talking about. And I don't think those elephants, if those elephants had been in this room, we wouldn't have been able to squeeze in. So just to remind us about like the depth and breadth of the global conversation, the global inquiry about what would make a truly appropriate, a truly empowering 21st century education. I'm just sort of thinking aloud about these things that come to mind. Have we got the content right in school? What's worth knowing in the 21st century? What is it that most young people are likely to need to know in order to lead lives that are fulfilled and responsible and so on? Who's asking that question? Some people are. One of my gurus is a man called David Perkins at Harvard, who's written a book recently called Future Wise, which is all about that question. But I don't hear a lot of it in the public forum. It's like it's a really difficult debate. Do kids really need to learn how to spend 5 weeks learning how to add fractions when they could be learning about international banking or about ecology or about the power of youth to create political activism, as in the case of Greta Thunberg? Do we really need the tutors, or are there better ways of thinking about government and the court and so on? These questions need asking. What to do about digitization? In many schools, the smartphone is still treated as a problem. How many schools are creating an environment within which they can have grown-up conversations with kids about what are the appropriate empowering uses of phones in school and what aren't? How much are we taking seriously Sugata Mitra's idea of the school in the cloud, or self-organizing learning communities? His research, which some people, I think, for motives of their own, are inclined to rubbish, but his research that shows that groups of children with one internet-enabled device and an irresistible question are capable of teaching themselves massive amounts, even if they're 5 and 6 years old. Kids are using their phones sometimes for disreputable purposes, for sexting or just for social engagement. But I have friends whose 11-year-old granddaughters, happens to be two 11-year-old granddaughters, one of whom is, unbeknownst to her parents, has downloaded an app to teach herself Japanese, and another is teaching herself second-year undergraduate orthopedic surgery because her granddad's going into hospital and she wants to find out what's going to be going on. And I think that's probably not unusual these days. How are we capitalizing on that? People are wondering about what are exam results and degree classes good for. I have a neighbor who's a director of Deloitte's. Big firms like Deloitte's and PricewaterhouseCoopers and Ernst & Young and even Pearson are now seriously experimenting when they're recruiting for people, and Google, when they're recruiting for people to work in their companies, with application procedures which do not allow you to say what university you went to or what class of degree you got, let alone your A-levels or your GCSEs. Because they have found, these are hard-nosed business people, that those metrics do not predict the kinds of minds that they want in their businesses. So that's a big question, isn't it? It's like, is it worth what we think it is? Are exams still good for selection? Exams were designed to be selective, and they still are selective. They're norm reference. They're designed so that 20 or 30% of kids, sometimes more, are destined to be losers in the examination game. Is that good? Can we afford to squander the talents that they have? Does education damage mental health? Look at the number of hundreds of thousands of calls to Childline, and you might wonder about that. Does it reduce stress or does it increase stress? Stress, roughly, in my understanding as a psychologist, is what happens when the perceived demands on you begin to overwhelm your perceived resources to cope with the demands. So in my understanding, and lots of other people, education should be about increasing the resources that you have to cope with the demands in life and thereby reduce your stress. Whereas many youngsters don't perceive it that way at all. They perceive education as a net stressor, as something that merely increases the demands on their lives without doing much to increase the resources that they have, to increase the mental capacity, the competence that they have to cope with those resources. Does education squander youthful idealism, energy, and creativity? Are there ways of educating that would give us more Greta Thunbergs? I met recently a young woman called Imani Thompson. She's 19. She's got a place to read English at Cambridge here next year. She's travelling at the moment. She got 12 A stars in her GCSEs, 4 A stars in her A-levels, and she is raging about the education that she got and the damage that it did to her creativity, to her self-esteem, the way she had to contort her mind in order to be able to get those grades is something that has left her spitting feathers. And that's a success. That's one of the conspicuous successes of the system. Should we take Imani seriously? She's writing a book about this at the moment. She's 19. Do schools create good thinkers, intelligent consumers, confident bullshit detectors in a world of fake news and so on? Or are we encouraging kids to be passive consumers, to be credulous buyers of information that comes to them through school? God knows the world needs people who are good, critical, creative thinkers. The world is made a more dangerous place by people who can only think in black and white, can only think in one or two dimensions. The world is made safer, communities are made more cohesive and productive by people who know how to think in a way that is subtle and accurate. But we're seeing at the moment how our democracy is designed to work with people who are intelligent thinkers, people who are able to think in shades of grey, not just in or out, deal or no deal, not the Noel Edmonds level of thinking that we're seeing about Brexit at the moment. Do schools cultivate, one more. Are we right to disdain practical and vocational education? Or is that a squandering of talent? Just look at the subjects that you can drop early. Just look at the people who end up doing vocational subjects at GCSE, and you'll get a clear idea. Just look at the number of periods in the week devoted to different subjects, and you'll get an idea of the hierarchy of esteem. People who are highly intelligent in practical and creative ways leave schools feeling that one of the most important things they've learned is that they're crap at learning. Are we happy with that? Is that necessary collateral damage of the only kind of education system that it's possible for us to have? Do schools cultivate dysfunctional attitudes? People are beginning to wonder about that. Are schools culpable in producing people who may be high achievers, but who come out of school passive, dependent, timid, dogmatic, and unadventurous in their approach to knowledge? Some schools do. Some students do. They didn't arrive at age 4 or 5 like that, but they may leave schools with those attitudes. What about youngsters who come out of school disaffected, resentful, feeling disabled as learners? Is that tolerable? Is that a good outcome? Someone who, when they lose their job, feels so depressed and so defeated because they don't feel they could learn another. There are lots of examples of people in the literature who have that shrunken, crippled sense of their lives as learners. Did they get that at school? Were we inadvertently doing things that might have led to those attitudes? What about people who come out of education with this absolutist, fundamentalist, black and white, us and them, true and false attitudes? And people are writing at the moment about that education can fuel fundamentalism. In certain parts of the world, science and engineering are disciplines which produce an astonishingly high proportion of active, intelligent fundamentalists, terrorists around the world. In the MENA countries, Middle East and North Africa, roughly 50% of known terrorists have degrees in science, maths, medicine, and engineering. Some of them have higher degrees. And one of the reasons may be that those subjects attract people who believe in absolute truth and absolute certainty and right and wrong, and then enhance those attitudes and those feelings by teaching those subjects as if there were no alternatives, as if these bodies of knowledge were somehow secure and God-given. What about people who come out of schools, sometimes very expensive schools, glib and smug and competitive and argumentative, who treat Brexit as if it were a game like the sixth form debating society at Eton? Are they good products of our education system? Are we happy with that? What would be good alternatives? What kinds of habits of mind? This is my second question. What will be good attitudes of mind for 21st century? We hear a lot about resilience and well-being and mental health. What about love of reading? We know that from the natural literacy strategy, it had two main effects. It raised kids' level of reading ability marginally and damaged their love of reading substantially. Yet we also know that love of reading is one of the most effective predictors of people's success in life, measured however you like. Do we foreground that, or is measuring it too difficult for the bean counters in Whitehall? They're happier with things that are more objective. What about the ability to think on your feet? Undergraduate applicants to this university are routinely tossed a question that they can't possibly have anticipated, can't possibly have prepared for. You're being interviewed to read music at Keble College, and suddenly out of the blue, the admissions tutor asks you on Skype or face-to-face, why do you think manhole covers in the road are round? Not because he's interested or she's interested in the answer, but because she wants to know whether you can think on your feet, whether you have fluid intelligence, whether you have what the Google people call learning agility. Are we teaching that in school? How would we be teaching that in school? Again, it's something that different companies want. Are we teaching people to control their attention in a world where the digital world is full of clever little glitzy things that are trying to grab our attention? Are we teaching kids how to pay attention to that which is really important and that which is meaningful? How many of your schools have got the mindfulness bug? Mindfulness is a set of exercises which enable you to gain greater control over your attention. Isn't that useful in the 21st century? Are we deliberately cultivating that? Are we keen to discover ways in which we could get kids to manage their attention, their attentional resources more intelligently? Are we teaching them to question knowledge? Are we teaching skepticism? Are we teaching that, what Ernest Hemingway called built-in shockproof crap detector? Isn't that useful? Wouldn't you want your daughter, when she goes online, to have a skeptical attitude, saying, how do I know this is true? How do I know this person is who they say they are? Are we using our history textbooks as a vehicle for developing that appropriately skeptical attitude towards knowledge claims? Or are we still cramming the knowledge in order, because we think that grades and examination passes are the main outcome of education? Are we teaching intellectual humility? I was reading a paper the other day which shows that people's general knowledge, their ability to access and retain knowledge, is powerfully predicted by their intellectual humility, by their ability to say, I don't know, I'm not sure. Has anybody else got a better idea? How could we find out? Is that on the agenda at school? Are we looking at ways of building those kinds of capacities? So I'm interested in character, what I call epistemic character, which is beyond the holy trinity of grit and growth mindset and resilience. Character is an awful lot more than that, and it's an awful lot more than kindness and generosity and gratitude and forgiveness. In these complicated days where people are bombarded with choices and difficulties and opportunities and lures and threats to their well-being, those abilities are pretty paramount, I would have thought. Where are they on the curriculum? Third question, what would be better? Could we be paying attention to these things better? And I think it's not that difficult, actually. There are lots of schools represented in this room, Ray's school, lots of other schools, that are really making good progress with this. It's actually not hard to tweak, to shift the mood music of a classroom, to redesign it so that instead of running the risk of breeding youngsters who are compliant, anxious, test passers, little performers, we have a room full of courageous, adventurous, inquisitive, articulate explorers. It's not difficult. Oh, and by the way, getting good results. By the way, actually getting even better results on their tests if we do that. Are we all creating classrooms where it's safe to be a learner? Safe to imagine, safe to be half-baked, safe to explore, safe to do trial and error? Not everybody is yet, but it's not hard to do it. But we just may need to change our language a little bit, the messaging of the classroom a little bit, the attitude that we encourage, knowingly or unknowingly, to mistakes a little bit. We can all do that. The learning power approach, building learning power that I've been involved in, and dozens of other similar initiatives around the world are producing robust evidence as to how easy it is to make that shift in 2 or 3 months, 2 or 3 weeks sometimes, in a classroom, so that you have that level of inquisitiveness. We have to shift so that there's time to learn. Imagining, experimenting, saying what if and how come and let's try takes time. Lots of schools have moved from a 50-minute lesson to a 2 or 3 hour lesson. The head teacher I was talking to a little while ago has designed his school around whole day lessons or half day lessons, because we need time. These attitudes incubate over time when there's time to explore, time to imagine, time to experiment, time to argue, time to discuss. Do we encourage talking about the process of learning? What was hard? What did I find tricky? Did I find a new way of doing this? The nature of the discourse in the classroom is critical. Do we always make sure that we have challenging activities, attitudes that children can choose and customize so that they're always engaged in something that is interestingly challenging in the classroom, rather than in many classrooms where a third of the kids are spinning their wheels because what they're doing is too easy, and another third are sitting there feeling miserable because they don't know how to get a handle on it. It's not difficult to devise ways, the traffic lights, or try 3 before me, or lots of different little techniques in the classroom to establish that world, to establish that view. Lots of exploratory talk, lots of opportunities to review and improve. Many of you will have watched Austin's Butterfly, but how much difference has that made to the routine pedagogy in your school? Did you just think it was cute and interesting, or did you take it back to your school and revolutionize the nature of pedagogy so that over lessons children are learning to review, to critique their own and each other's work, to enjoy the process of improving, to discover what Ricky Gervais the other day called the joy of the struggle, to get something right when he was writing scripts for The Office, or when John Cleese was writing the scripts for Fawlty Towers. Effort, time, frustration, screwing up a day's work and throwing it away because when you woke up in the morning you didn't think it was good enough. That sense of craftsmanship that Ron Berger has been so good. And are we looking at how to give increasing responsibility to kids in their classrooms so that are we constantly walking on the optimistic edge, constantly saying to ourselves, I wonder if this group are ready to do this for themselves yet? Ready to design learning activities for themselves, ready to mark their own or each other's work, to do that for themselves, ready to design little bits of the timetable for themselves, so that we're constantly inviting them to stretch their ability to be mature and responsible, not encouraging them to be dependent on us to design, to structure, to critique, to troubleshoot learning, but learning how to do that for themselves. It's not hard to do. So it's quite easy. So I come to the fourth question, which is, so why is the big conversation not happening? Where is it? In England, there's a resounding silence. There are places like this where people are sharing ideas. But have you heard any of the candidates to be our next Prime Minister talk about this stuff yet? What could be more important than the human resource of the next generation? Where is the big conversation about this happening? Why isn't it bigger? Well, I think one of the reasons is because there are some unfortunate beliefs embedded in people's minds about education that impinge on our thinking. And one of them is to do with, I was just reading an old paper from 1991 the other day about mistaken beliefs about intelligence. Just wanted to read you a little quote. Something is interfering with our capacity to mobilize our resources and our know-how to educate children. It's this. We operate from the self-fulfilling conviction that only a relatively small percentage of children are intelligent enough to become well educated. This belief has a profoundly negative impact on our pedagogy, and it discourages mobilization of an effective movement for educational reform. Yet that view of intelligence is still alive and well. There are schools in which teachers still think it's legitimate and useful to quickly diagnose kids as bright or average or struggling or low ability. Schools that have not yet expunged that concept from their vocabularies. So whilst they're sticking up what Tom Sheraton calls the cheesy growth mindset posters, they're still talking and thinking and writing about children in a way that undermines their resilience. So are we looking carefully enough at our own existing procedures rather than bolting on a bit of flipped classroom here and a bit of growth mindset there and a bit of grit over there and a bit of blended learning over here, and if we've got thousands of pounds to spend, a Harkness table that we're terribly proud of, all those kinds of little bolt-ons. Are we looking at the routine, the minutiae, William Blake's minute particulars of the mood music in our classrooms, to make sure that we've got that right first, and then we can proceed. Intelligence isn't fixed. Ask Lauren Resnick, the doyen of American intelligence researchers, who will tell you that intelligence is the sum total of your habits of mind, not this fixed-sized life sentence. It depends on your resilience. It depends on your ability to tolerate uncertainty. It depends on whether you have a need for closure, so you jump onto a simplistic answer fast in order to escape from the feeling of being stupid or being confused. Our intelligence is a whole composite of beliefs and attitudes, as Carol Dweck's work has shown very powerfully. Another of these beliefs is that there's some kind of, that you have to have knowledge before you can get kids to think. There are some people at conferences who are perpetuating that idea. It's as if you can't think about designing the extension to your house until you've got an enormous pile of bricks on your lawn. You have to fill kids' minds with facts, and then they can think about them. That's just a stupid idea about learning. And there are some silly ideas about the relationship between short-term and long-term memory going around, like the idea that you have to cram facts into long-term memory because short-term memory has a limited capacity. I don't have time here to unpick all the ways in which that is silly nonsense, but it's a misreading of a very old-fashioned view of psychology. The idea that when you start talking about building learning attitudes or character traits or process, that somehow that must mean that you're anti-knowledge or anti-rigor is an idea that is around in the ether at the moment. As if just because I'm interested in building children's learning power, that means obviously that I no longer care about Shakespeare or algebra or the periodic table. Well, that's just crap. You can have both. Kids become more resilient by grappling, learning to enjoy grappling with difficult subject matter in schools. This is not a way of dumbing down education. This is a way of remembering that education is warp as well as weft, that knowledge and understanding, knowledge and the ability to think are woven together tightly in the curriculum. And that's what we need to be remembering about. We need to combat the tyranny of measurement, the belief that nothing is worth thinking about unless it's been proved in a randomized controlled trial. Some of you will have read a really good blog recently by Dylan William, which says, teaching is not a research-based profession. Why? Because it's much more complicated than medicine. A room full of kids is much more complicated. It's not a collection of simplistic cause and effect relationships. It's a highly complex adaptive system that we are trying to influence and trying to change. So we need to escape from that obsession with measurement. The idea that you can ignore this stuff about 21st century skills and just get on with teaching maths. No, you can't. Nobody ever just taught maths. They always taught either maths plus timidity, maths plus fear of making mistakes, maths plus compliance, maths plus dependency, or they taught maths plus adventurousness, maths plus experimentation, maths plus confidence. You can't get off this one. We're all in the business of character shaping in the classroom, not ignoring it. But the last one, you can't teach character. Trying to talk about back to the cheesy growth mindset posters. You can't just stick up a poster and imagine you've done the job. These habits of mind are cultivated in an environment where rich, challenging activities require you to stretch your resilience, stretch your imagination, stretch your experimentation, stretch your articulacy in the course of getting something interesting done, in the course of producing something that you're proud of. It's not difficult, but we need to make sure that as well as building up our energy and our enthusiasm, we just have to make sure that we've got the brakes off our own thinking, the brakes off our views of education. And then I think we'll start to have the conversation and the speed of reform that the next generation have the right to expect from us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.